Well, thank you. I thought it would be interesting just to have a conversation with Herb, who is one of the smartest persons I know on all things cyber. And I thought it would be an interesting discussion, especially that, well, if you go back, I'd say we lived in an era of techno-optimism for a long time. I would say that Estonia had a particular role in destroying that. I mean, or let's say the Russians did in 2007, when what is probably the first, I mean, Estonia went through a cyber attack in 2007 that mobilized much of the country. And up till that time, there was no absence of nasty cyber activity, but it had never been public, overt, and sort of follow the von Clausewitz definition of war as the continuation of policy by other means. And so we will always, little Estonia will always be in the history books, if at least when it comes to cyber, as the beginning of sort of the first cyber war. I wouldn't call it a cyber war, but things began to look a little dystopian. And some of this was pointed out already by Evgeny Moroz about 10 years ago, talking about how, well, in fact, all of this optimism might be misguided. But even as late as 2011, we had the Arab Spring, in which the U.S. government and people like Alec Ross, who was the digital guru for Secretary Clinton, sort of using social media to promote freedom of speech or to get sort of opinions through Twitter, through Facebook, keeping Twitter up, even though the Egyptian government had turned it down or turned off. And so there's all this hope, much of which turned out to be hype, some of which is being, I think, pursued to this day in terms of, the ability of Facebook to actually connect people and get ideas flowing. Now, I would say that since things have changed dramatically in the 6 years or so, 2011 was the first year that the premier security conference of the world, the Munich Security Conference, actually had its first panel on cybersecurity. I mean, if you think that's 6 years ago, before that, it wasn't even considered a security issue. Nowadays, if you read the headlines, it's about as depressing as you can get, ranging from, sort of things like 143 million Americans having their financial data stolen, from in the Equifax case to all of the revelations we see today about how Facebook and Twitter were manipulated in the electoral process. In fact, we also have big evidence of manipulation in the French presidential election. The German parliament has been infiltrated and hacked. The Italian foreign ministry, even the World Anti-Doping Association has been attacked by the same hacking group as attacked the Democratic National Committee, as hacked the Italian foreign ministry. So things look kind of bleak. And if every day, just yesterday, Twitter was testifying before Congress. So we're facing a rather new and different view of what the digital revolution that we all were so optimistic about, where it is today. And I thought we would discuss with Herb, well, what are the problems? I mean, why are we in this mess? How we can get out of it, where to go, and also perhaps at the end, before we finish up, I thought one little thing we'd add at the end is that what can each one of us do to make our lives a little bit more secure online, because our lives have become so entangled with the digital world.
So one way of thinking about it, when I try to explain the significance of all of this, of what we've been seeing in the news lately about election hacking around the world and so on, let me just ask you the following question. What do you think Hitler could have done with the internet? Right. I mean, but if you think about the Hitler, the descriptions of of propaganda in Mein Kampf, where he describes almost to a T what you see in many elections, especially our own in the United States in 2016. So to me, it's an interesting question. What you say, a lot. Well, that's worth unpacking. What would it mean to be a lot? And to me, if I start thinking about it in those terms, I get really scared. What Toomas has said about the internet and social promise of social media and so on, and why the internet had all of these utopian dreams ahead of it, and as a unifying force in the world, and building community and all that sort of stuff. It was able to do all of this stuff because the governments hadn't started to pay attention to the internet. They didn't realize that it was something that was an issue. So a lot of people did a lot of things without government interference because the governments hadn't woken up. Well, guess what? Governments have woken up. And there is all kinds of interesting potential there. And I speak, to this with some history. I am, in fact, a former hacker. When I did it, it was not illegal. Okay, so no statute of limitation. It was not illegal. The laws that were passed in the United States were addressed my friends and me. But illegal access of computers and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't illegal because it wasn't a crime. But some of us in the early days saw that there was negative potential, and we were roundly booed when we wanted to talk about that. So it is a different world now.
I remember the first time just from my own background, I learned to program when I was 14 years old in 1969. So you can date me there. And that has always been a very positive thing in my life because it led to me pushing the same kind of stuff in Estonia for 25 years. But I remember in 1973 reading an article, my first article about cybercrime, which was that people working for New York banks, when they round your interest to in the third place, so you'd get so they round it down instead of up, and you'd end up getting a thousandth of a penny on an interest calculation. The problem is you have a bank with several 100,000 customers, and they're constantly having their interest rounded down, not up, in the sort of the third decimal point, so no one would ever notice, and making a lot of money. And I said, wow, you can actually do great crimes with computers. But I think it took a while for this to become such a massive phenomenon. I think the first really big penetration of anything governmental was the Moonlight
maze?
Maze, right. And that was 1999. I mean, they've been earlier things, but then suddenly the U.S. Department of Defense, we found out about this much later. Clearly, no one talked about it, but that, the Russians had hacked into the Department of Defense. Since then, you have lots of news about hackings into, but that was, and it took a while for the U.S. government, which has actually always been at the lead on this, to actually get to a point to say, we have to deal with this. And one of the problems that the government faced then, which I think which I guess the population at large today has, is that you don't really take it that seriously if it's digital. The real world, the physical world is serious. But the digital stuff, nah. And as an example, I would bring think of the Watergate break-in in 1972. No newspaper would ever have, had they stolen things, which they didn't because they got caught, but had they stolen, the correspondence from there and offered it to the New York Times or the Washington Post, they go, no, that's the stolen material. Whereas in 2016, if you hack into computers, that's not the same thing as a paper letter. It's just an email, and look what Hillary Clinton did. That's we don't, or newspapers think that's different, and we think that a missile that would attack an electrical power plant is very bad. But what happens if you have some malware that is injected in there that shuts it down, as we've seen twice in Ukraine, where we've seen power plants shut down with malware. And there's this inability to believe in this stuff. And I'll hand it over to Herbie. And just one more sort of real thing that happened was that from 2004 to 2007, Estonia was constantly trying to get NATO to address cyber issues. NATO has all of these centers of excellence, I think 82 of them, dealing with all kind of military arcana, like, things like they have in northern Germany. There's a Center for Operations in Closed and Shallow Waters. And they have an entire center. And we said, we need one for cyber. No, we don't need this. And when, in fact, we had the attack in 2007, it really, aside from the United States, most of the NATO countries said, nah, you have some problem over there. This is not really real. And it was only when they started doing the forensics and the study and the US kind of realized that this was serious that NATO then said, oh, well, maybe we do need a center for cybersecurity for NATO. But that was 10 years ago, or the center was set up in 2010. So 7 years ago, NATO got there, and that was, a year later, you started having public security conferences dealing with this issue. So it's all happened very quickly. And I think part of the problem is that we don't think it really can do anything. And now when we see all the kinds of manipulations and the accidents, you have, Equifax. Basically almost all adults in the United States have had their financial data stolen.
So I think that there's a phrase, and let me tell you just a couple of key phrases here. The first phrase is that the modern terrorist may be able to do more with a keyboard than with a bomb. And a bank robber criminal may be able to steal more money with a keyboard than with a gun. Okay, and you recognize those kinds of statements. Those are almost direct quotes, not exactly, but the question is, when were they written in a National Academy of Sciences report in the United States? And the answer to that question is 1991. Okay, so those statements are completely contemporary, right? But it came out of a National Academy of Sciences report in 1991. And if you think about how much information technology has changed since 1991, right? 1991, the World Wide Web hadn't been invented. Okay, 1991, 100 megabyte hard drive. Megabyte hard drive was a big hard drive, and you paid several $100s for it. You can go down to Costco now and get a 5 terabyte drive for less than $100 now. Okay. Your high-speed connections, your internet connections, and so on. I complain when I get 1 megabit on my cell phone, right? And back then, in 1991, I guess I was still thinking about, home access. Still, was thinking about 56 kilobit access, right? So this is ridiculous, right? So information technology has completely changed. The security technology that you're using, all of you use passwords. It's 50 years old, right? What kind of world are we living in here? So everything is different in IT except security. I could take that report from 1991 and issue it right now, change the cover on it, and all the recommendations would still be valid.
Well, in the current model of security that we use on virtually everything was invented, I guess, in 1979 or so, and throughout the 80s was used in if there are academics who were around then doing this, there was something called BitNet, which was a network of professors around the world, 3,500 of them. Later it grew a little bit. In the mid-'80s, 3,500 people using this form of security, which is your email address and a password. So from 3,500 in the 1980s, today we have, depending on who you ask, either 3.5 billion people on the internet, or Google says 4.2 billion. And we're still using the same form of security. And we should also all know that no single password today is unbreakable. You can force break any password. And so you get all these long strings if you're, that Apple will say, well, use this. Well, it makes it harder to do it, and it's more computing time, but than it is to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But basically, all things are hackable. In that, as long as we have that model of computer security, the question is how do you get people to go beyond that?
Right. Think about the advice you get when you write a password. Don't write it down, and don't make it easy to guess. Right? This is good advice. This passes for good advice in computer security. You got to do better than that, and we don't know how to do better than that.
Well, we do. We do know how to do better than that.
But it's hard to get people to do it, to deploy it. Yes, but it's hard to get people to do it on a widespread basis. Now, so let me ask you something. So, do you think that when you say that the NATO is taking the threat of cyber more seriously, I believe that rhetorically, but do you see actually resource commitments to that and significant attention in terms of personnel and expertise and dollars going to it?
It's slow. Well, I mean, we should say Warsaw Summit this summer just actually made a major advance, which was that NATO, up till this summer, dealt with 3 domains of warfare: air, land, and sea. And this year, the NATO, then all the countries came together and decided, well, there's a 4th domain, and that's cyber. So the decision's like 3 months old. What that means for commitments, I don't know, in terms of money. The United States, it was only 5 years ago, it declared cyber the 5th domain because the US had already declared space as the 4th domain. And so now the United States agrees that in addition to the Army, Navy, Air Force, there that deal with those 3 domains, and I guess there are units that deal with space. So now there is there's cyber, and I don't know how that's all going to work out because there's a reorganization because the National Security Agency is not a command unit, and whether you're going how that works out, I don't know. But the point is, it's 5 years ago the U.S. decided this is actually a domain of warfare. And so it's the realization of all of this is very, very slow. And sometimes it goes backwards too because the US State Department had a group of people dealing with IT, digital, and cyber issues. And the guy who had been running that, who in fact had been doing this through several administrations, was just fired. And the unit seems to be downgraded. So maybe that's not, I would argue that's not the wisest decision, especially given what we see. So there's a slow realization, and I think that it will not, I also think things will change now. And I think that, first of all, when it hits people's pocketbooks in the way that the recent Equifax thing did, so basically in all of your financial data have been hacked or stolen. Whether anything is done with that, who knows? But that should get people annoyed. 2 years ago, all federal employee records were hacked from the Office of Personnel Management, and again showing the level of sophistication that wasn't needed to do anything. All federal employee data were stored in unencrypted clear text form. So you didn't really have to work hard. You could steal it and you could read it. So it wasn't as if like, oh no, now we have to go and unencrypt all this or decrypt this and figure out who's who. Who was the guy who worked for CIA and who was the guy who worked for the U.S. Forest Service. You didn't have to do any of that. And it's slow. And even today, one unfortunately true story is that one way of getting around this is that you have chip cards with, it's like your credit card with a chip on it, but you have a chip card which you have two-factor authentication, which we can talk about. But basically, that's like the minimum for having secure communication. And so since 2003 or 2004, the U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Defense, and the U.S. military use these chip cards to make sure your identity is secure. The U.S. Congress there was an article this May, the U.S. Congress, at least the staffers, have ID cards. But
if you look at it, it looks like it has a chip.
But it's a decal.
It's a picture of a chip.
Just tape it on.
True story.
No, yeah, I mean.
You can't make this up.
And so, I mean, this is like, so everyone, I guess you can feel good. It looks like I have a chip card, but it doesn't do anything, so the communication is not secure. And if you think, well, I mean, look at it this way. The Parliament of Germany was hacked a number of times, and which was a real big worry before the German elections this past weekend, that what had they taken, what will come out, and nothing really did come out. We have similar break-ins in all kinds of institutions in the liberal democratic West that have been used. In the case of the DNC hack, there were 126 employees at the Democratic National Committee. And the Democratic National Committee actually was working pretty well. Of the 126 employees, 124 actually used a two-factor authentication system to get access to the server. Problem was, 2 didn't. All it takes is 1. And so if you want to get access to the DNC server, all you need to do is hack someone who actually has has very poor security. And the way most of the hacks that take place at this level come about through something like spear phishing, which I'm sure almost every one of you has had, where you get an email, you get it from, I don't know, whoever. I mean, I get ones from Apple all the time, or sometimes I get it from things I don't even use, like PayPal, and I get a mail from PayPal that says your account is something, whatever. You immediately log on and change your password. And so if you don't know who you're responding to, you'll go in there, and I mean, it's not Apple that's writing to you, and it's not PayPal or whatever bank. I mean, sometimes I get banks that I've never even heard of saying, your account has been breached or something, and so then people will, go, oh my God, they've gotten into my account. I'm going to have to change my password. Well, in fact, you change the password, and all you do is you give them your new password, and then they can break into it. And that's what happened with the DNC, is that same thing happened also to whichever Podesta it was, John Podesta. Yeah. I mean, he got a spear phishing attack, and what he was dumber was he sent it off to his IT guy and says, "This okay?" And he wrote back, "It is okay," but he forgot to write the word "not." And so that's how we all found out what John Podesta's risotto recipe is, because even that was. So these are things that where we simply have not caught up in our day-to-day use with the sophistication of people who want to use the internet and IT for bad ends, to steal our money or to steal our identity, to make money, or in fact to affect the political process, as we've seen here.
And the fundamental problem is with all this stuff is that I can tell you how to build easily in this room right now, and I will, a perfectly unhackable computer. I take the computer and I put a sealed metal box around it. So nothing can get in, nothing can get out. Very few people would argue that that computer is insecure. It's useless, but it's insecure, right? And so the problem is that what you want, the goal of security, the fundamental goal of security, is to differentiate between sort of good inputs and bad inputs. That can mean program, that can mean data, that can mean users, and so on. So I have to take this box a way that lets some stuff through. And that means whatever filter I use has to be able to perfectly differentiate between good stuff and bad stuff getting through. And you're relying on a machine to do it. And that's really tough, right? The goal of security is to make your machine perfectly, absolutely, completely transparent to you. You can use it anytime you want for any purpose you want and make it totally unusable for a bad guy, right? That's what it's supposed to do. That's the goal of security. And if you think you can do that perfectly, you're living in a fool's paradise, right? You can't do that perfectly. And that's the dilemma that you have. And all of security is basically meant to increase the inconvenience, the unusability for the bad guy. And sometimes it makes it unusable for you, right? So mostly, as far as I can tell, the security that I put around my systems keeps me out. I think that's true for most of us, right? Mostly it keeps us out, okay, I think. At least I waste a lot of time trying to, sort of undo, redo my password and remember, and all that sort of stuff. But that's the price I pay for the good things that it gives me. And the point is we got to do better on that.
Well, concretely, I would say, there are things that are much better than what we have right now. And those solutions have been around for 20 years. One example, how many people are in the Stanford system here? Well, you do have this, you have two-factor authentication here for getting into the system. It's very cumbersome, I'd say. It's very badly designed. And I'm actually amazed that Stanford, that already has ID cards, doesn't issue chip-based ID cards that would allow you to do it much more simply rather than doing it over the mobile phone for your second factor, which, knowing that the mobile phones are the protocol used for communicating mobile phones has been hacked, is compromised. The SS7 protocol has even been used for two-factor authentication bank theft, because you can, if you get your second factor on your mobile phone and it says this number, whereas you would say Google, Apple, they use the same thing. If it goes over the mobile phone, that's hackable. It has been hacked. A bank in Germany lost $3 million. But the point is that not even those things are in effect in crucial areas. For example, the voter registration rolls of U.S. states, which have been breached in, depending on who you ask, 21 or 39 states. The Department of Homeland Security says 21 states. The bizarrely named Ms. Reality Winner, who worked for NSA, she stole a document that said 39 states had been breached by the Russians. In their voter rolls had been breached. I don't know which one's true, but the point is there is so little security in such crucial areas that affect our democracies. Not to mention the more serious stuff in terms of pure security. I'm no expert, you know much more on this, but your infrastructure, your electricity grid. My favorite is what happens if someone hacks your traffic light system? And you can imagine the city of Los Angeles. First, imagine what happened to the city of Los Angeles if you turn all the lights red. And then imagine what would happen in the city of Los Angeles or in Manhattan if you turn all of the lights green. Right? These are things that are, so we have to worry about all of these systems that are working now much better because they're computerized, yet we have not paid enough attention to the security of these systems because they can be turned around to become our greatest sort of security risk.
A huge miles and miles traffic jam caused around Moscow because a computer-operated billboard was turned into a large-scale display for porn flicks. And you can imagine the traffic backups around that huge. So, yes, a cyber attack of some sort. Nobody quite knows what was going on behind it. But there are examples of this already on the books.
Well, clearly, what we all need is to really. My argument is that the first line of defense is identity, and that is what you need: a secure identity online. And as long as you don't have a secure identity that really is you, you know you're you, the person you're communicating knows you're you, the bank knows you're you, you know the bank is that bank, that we will continue to fall victim to these things. And the problem is that there are solutions, I mentioned they're 20 years old, but they're just a little more cumbersome. And are we willing to give up the comfort of just, having your the email address and your computer stored password, because it's much easier just to sort of go onto a site and there it's auto-filled and you just press, go and.
But even that, how many of you are, you'll use multiple passwords on multiple sites and so on. Some sites, just as an example, in your password require you to have a special character. Others forbid it. What kind of crap is this? Right? Even just such a simple standardization, you should all allow it. And you should all allow passwords of more than 8 characters, and so on. We just don't, the infrastructure doesn't support doing even the basic stuff.
Well, I would ask you, since you have been in the U.S. government, I can ask myself, I know what the Estonian government did, but what, and we did it, but what should the U.S. government do? What do you think is politically possible?
You mean for the...
Well, basically to at least provide a minimal level of security or require a minimal level of security so that citizens and companies and so on actually adopt a higher level of security.
It's an issue that I've been agnostic about for a long time, but I think I'm now ready to step to say publicly, which I've said it publicly before now too, so this isn't the first time. But I have come to the conclusion that you've got to hold vendors of products, of IT products and services liable for cybersecurity breaches. And with all of the consequences that entails. It's not a regulation. I don't think that regulation is feasible in this country. To say everybody must do 16-character password or whatever it is that you want to mandate. But the liability issue, I think, is coming, and it's inevitable, and it's because of something that you mentioned earlier, which is the Internet of Things. The argument is the following: that we have a very well-established liability regime for toasters, right? Your toaster burns make toast, your toaster burns your house down, there's an investigation, and the manufacturer has liability for that toaster. Okay, if there are compromises in the safety and security and so on, there's an investigation, there's fact-finding and so on. There's a well-established liability regime. Now when you put on internet connectivity to your toaster, and your internet-enabled toaster, that is your Internet of Things, your Internet of Toasters, has now burns your house down. It strains credibility to say that the liability, that the manufacturer will be able to say, no, forget about the IT part of it. There's no liability involved in that. Okay, and we're going to separate, we're going to bracket that off, and that doesn't count. That's not going to happen. So one way or another, some judge somewhere is going to establish the precedent that all of these anti-liability clauses and so on are invalid and against good public policy. And at that point, there'll be a flood of it, and there will be breaches, there will be liability, tort liability for security.
I would go further. I would say that, in fact, the companies that also maintain your data or your money or your infrastructure. One of the things right now, at least in most cases, if there's a computer attack on, say, the power system, the losses incurred are written off, and bizarrely enough, you would say it was an act of God. And in fact, in the case of a hack, right, it is anything but God, or anyone but God who just sort of shut down the electrical grid. And the same thing with banks.
Right.
Banks have been, for ever since we started seeing computer crime, they write those losses off. Well, in fact, you should say that you can't write those off, and then you'll have to go get insurance, and your insurance company will say to the bank that unless you do this, 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 and this, we will not insure you.
Right.
But that requires the federal government or whatever, I mean, any country's government to say that we do not accept on your tax returns losses written off due to computer fraud, which would then force the companies to actually say, well, we better start dealing with this.
Well, right, and you're right. There are a variety of things. The point here being that I don't know that direct regulation is feasible, but tort liability would go a long way to encourage greater attention to cybersecurity, in my view.
Well, there's another thing you can do, which we do in Estonia, which is that everyone has a chip ID. You don't have to use it. You can operate without it. But if you want to have secure communications on anything from your healthcare records to getting permission to dig a hole in front of your house, you do that all online and completely securely with a two-factor authenticated chip card.
I have a lot of sympathy for the idea and I have gone down the path of advocating such a thing or things which are much weaker than that but sort of point in that direction, and the political blowback from that is unbelievably negative. Right, it raises specters in the United States of national ID cards. Well, you say that's a good thing. But I go out into Arizona or Utah and so on, and I'll be lucky if people throw only tomatoes at me.
Well, I'll say two things. One is that I think that it will come in the United States, but not at a national level. I think what will happen, especially in a federal system as you have, so many of the services that in lots of countries are at a national level are at the state level. Banking, all kinds of stuff, basically at the state level. And I already know at least the 2 states that are thinking about offering this as a service.
And the Real ID, the Real ID Act, the feds passed the Real ID Act, which said that there are certain standards that have to be applied to driver's licenses and so on. And if you're in 43 states that comply with the Real ID Act, you can use your state ID to get into a federal building. And if you're not, if you're one of those unlucky 7 states that have refused to comply, then you need a different ID to get into a federal building or to fly in an airplane now.
Right. Well, the other thing I was going to mention, this is one of my cute experiences in coming to the United States. 5 minutes. Okay. I moved here in January. There were different places I could have gone to, but I really, coming from the most digital country in Europe, I said, I want to go to Silicon Valley, see what it's like. This is going to be great. I'll finally see all the stuff that I don't know anything about. And here I am at Stanford, and within a 10-mile radius, this is the mecca of digital innovation, IT, for the world. You have headquarters of Apple, Google, Facebook, Tesla, you just name them. They're all here. And all of the money that goes into IT is all funded up there somewhere on Sand Hill Road, where just billions of dollars move in and create all these wonderful things. And then I went to register my daughter to go to school here. And first of all, I had to prove that I lived here, which is a reasonable thing to do, but I had to show on paper either my lease or my electrical bill. And then I went, and since she's gone to school all the time in Estonia, she had to take ESL, or English as a Second Language exam, and so she did. And she placed out of it, because we have very good English teaching in Estonia. And so, but for her to go into a regular English class, I had to give my permission. So on 2 pieces of paper, I signed, and one of them I had to give to the school, and the other one I had to drive 4 miles to the Palo Alto School District office, just with my physical signature. And then I got there, and there's a long line. I said, I just have to drop off this piece of paper. And the last woman in line turned and said, we all have to drop off a piece of paper. But they have to make a photocopy of it. And then I started thinking about it, and I said, the only sort of nod to to something beyond the 1960s was the photocopying machine. And everything else was that was 1960. 60s yet, but everything else, the whole paper management and everything done in this very cumbersome way was all 1950s. And so here you are, you get an iPhone 10 and have augmented reality and Pokemons running around in your living room, but you cannot do the most essential, basic aspects of life in a simple way, which is easy to do, and people don't even know that. And this is that you could actually, all of that time spent could have just been done in about, I'd say a minute, where you would go on and you had an effective system that could do it. And so I say, in my country, the only things you need to do in person are get married and get divorced. That's the harder one. And then also a physical property transfer where you have to say, okay, I'm selling this house, and you have the buyer and the seller.
Establish a foundation.
Pardon me?
Establish a foundation.
Establish a foundation.
A foundation to do this.
You need to sign.
You do have to sign? Really? Okay. I didn't know that. I was always told 3. Okay, that must be new. All right. In any case, you see, but no one even thinks in those terms. So you have all this incredible entertainment and sort of comforts with Airbnb in the commercial sector, but when you get to the everyday life of being the citizen of a county or a town or a state or a country, it's all paper. Anyway, I think we're told. Say a few words because I think we're told that we're running out of time, and we'll go over to Q&A. Yeah.
I was sitting at the edge of my chair. Hello, everybody. My name is Afsana Naimola. I am a recovering investment banker. But I'm also an internet historian. I was on server number 77. So I remember when the internet started, sex and gambling. That's how internet started. And I remember the first advertisement on internet was a couple in New York were advertising their legal services. And everybody was like, how dare you? This is internet. You do not advertise on internet. So with that as a backdrop, I have a philosophical question and a comment. I think the pace of technology advancement is so quickened that I don't think security will catch up. I think it's just it's a race I don't think we can win. That's my personal opinion. And it really scares me when I think about self-driving cars, drone deliveries. It's all gonna happen. We're not gonna stop it. It's gonna happen. Like advertising happened. We can't stop the wave. So the cloud being a technology we can't stop. And how do you really build security around that and the applications that come with it? So I understand the torts. I understand some kind of a system of compensation for losses. But how do you really synchronize the fact that the technology is ahead of security technology? How do you do that? Do you stop it? How do you do that?
You want to take it or you want me?
Go ahead.
So I think that you're pointing out a very important trade-off, which is that security and innovation are at odds in certain ways. That today in innovation, being the first to market for something is really important. And any time that you spend on security in advance is wasted because it won't afford you the thing that you're trying to supply to the public. That's ultimately why I think liability is going to be the only way to do it, because you have to provide incentives for people to pay attention to security up front. And they don't do it right now because all of the incentives are in the opposite direction. It's from an economic standpoint, it's much better for me to put out my product now without any attention to security, get product buy-in and so on. And if there are security problems now, fix them later. Of course, you know that that's the crappy way of providing for security. But right now, there's no incentive to do anything else. And exhortations that I should do the right thing for the good of the nation, no, I mean, it affects my bottom line. So that's why you have to put in incentive upfront. That's why I think liability is the only way to go eventually in that. I don't see any other way to do that.
Well, I mean, there are certain areas where government policies would help at least. You have to get away from computers being, and IT being a capital expenditure to an operating expenditure. I mean, the United Kingdom's health service was running on a 14-year-old Windows system. This spring, the WannaCry ransomware affected only old Windows systems. And so if you had a new one, there was no problem. It didn't affect any computers in my country except for sort of dubious private sector companies that were cheap. But we have a rule that you have, and this is not only ours, and Latvia has this too, you must have the latest updates, you have to be au courant. In fact, what happened with Equifax was that they didn't patch something that was discovered 3 months earlier. So you need to find some kind of ways of sort of legislating that you don't have that, because you trust these companies, maybe, but they have your data. So you need to, and each of us ourselves should be neurotic about updating our software. They get patched all the time, and you just have to do it and not say, oh, well, I'll do that some other day.
And there's a way of using liability to support that. For example, if you patch, you could have reduced liability or something like that. I mean, there are all kinds of ways of dealing with that.
Nothing's going to save you completely, but there are things you can do.
Better, right.
And certainly even the sort of two-factor, sort of highly sort of sophisticated chip-based stuff, as soon as China, I guess, or somewhere here, someone figures out quantum computing, all that goes out the window too. So, I mean, we can't keep up, but we have to do our best.
My question is around cryptocurrencies. And I'd like to know your thoughts on the current state of cryptocurrencies with all the infrastructure that's being built around it, like blockchain and all of that, and what you think is next in the life cycle of cryptocurrency in a security perspective.
I'll let you take that.
I really don't know much about cryptocurrency. I do know a little bit about blockchain. And I'd say the whole thing that started off with cryptocurrencies, okay, Bitcoin, and wow, it wasn't just that it was anonymous, but it was actually that you could have very secure transfers far more than any other way. That then was taken up by fintech, which is, they realized the same thing, is that, well, they don't care about the anonymity, and they're actually more interested in identity, but in fact, you can maintain data integrity. That's really the issue, is that, you can't change your bank account. I mean, or you can't, you can't go into someone's bank account and take his money, which is a big fear. What we've done in Estonia, and we're the first country to do so, we actually put our national data on blockchain. Healthcare records, property records, interestingly enough, also court records, because our court records are all digital, they're no longer printed. And so I think if someone goes back and changes a court decision, which then is a precedent for something else in the future, those things cannot be changed because we use the blockchain technology. That's not answering your question. On the Bitcoin side, I don't know. I mean, those are, there will be more and more Bitcoin type things simply because it's getting too cumbersome, because the validation technique, or sort of that you have to have everyone in this public blockchain saying, yes, that is, validating a transaction, it just is slowing down and getting slower and slower, and so you'll have other ones and other ones. Where to go, I don't know. I do know that one guy in Estonia floated the idea of having an Estonian currency, and that was within days was quashed by the European Commission, and no.
So my short answer is that that cryptocurrencies raise deep philosophical questions about what the role of money is and what you want money to do and what properties you want to have it. And I don't think that we're anywhere near coming to consensus on the answers to those questions. Don?
Don Emerson, Freeman Spogli Institute. I have no opinion on this topic and no expertise either, but I would like to ask a question. As I was listening to you, I was imagining a dial. At one extreme is vulnerability, total vulnerability. At the other extreme is security, total security. And as you have spoken, I've been imagining the needle moving a little bit in one direction, a little bit in another direction. If I'm not misinterpreting the balance, because you know the balance, I don't, you spoke, I didn't. My sense of it is that vulnerability won. That is, there is certainly no perfect security, but given the scale of the penetration, the hacking and so forth, I think an ordinary person, myself included, would come away with the notion that vulnerability is just there. Now, doesn't that raise a question about the whole orientation of the session, which has been very much defensive? There's been no offensive response to the situation suggested. Now, I can see a lot of reasons why that would be unwise. I'll mention one in just a second. But I wonder, for example, if the elections in Russia, they're coming up, elections in quotation marks. What if, in response to what Putin did last year, the US government decided to hack that election so thoroughly that he would only get 7% of the vote instead of 97%?
The problem is just quickly to answer that part, is that the beauty of this thing from the point of view of authoritarians is that the vulnerable are only the liberal democracies. It's an asymmetric threat. We cannot do to them what they do to us in the case of democracy. We can do other things, but we can't really, if Vladimir Putin got 143%, as he did, of the vote in Rostov-on-Don last time, that survived. So hacking the election won't work there. You have to do other things if you want to have a response.
Well, forget the 7%. Nevertheless, there is some evidence, including what happened with the nuclear effort in Tehran. One thinks of Stuxnet and so forth. The answer is not to abandon entirely the notion of some kind of response. Yes, even a retaliatory response, right? Now, the tenor from your comment would suggest that this is partly unwise because it could escalate. Now, it could escalate to the point where in the future we will have a cyber equivalent of Hiroshima or of Nagasaki, which will be terrible. Mm-hmm. But after that, it's possible that there will be a regime underway that treats cyber weapons the way we now treat nuclear weapons, a kind of never again sort of moment. Am I just making this up?
No, I actually think personally, I think that we've seen that already. And one of the reasons that we haven't experienced a large-scale hack of our electrical system and so on is that it takes nation-state capabilities to do it, and it would be I wouldn't say easy, but at least doable in principle to figure out who did it, and we can do the same thing back to them. And I think that there is a kind of assured destruction capability in cyberspace at the high end for a lot of this stuff. So I think that the scenario that you described is not at all implausible. But the problem with escalating, but with taking offensive action, which as was stated in the introduction, I'm a fan of under some circumstances. If you want to take offensive action, you better be prepared for any response that you get. Okay? And that means you got to be willing to go to the mat. And if you're not willing to go to the mat, don't start the cycle. And for a variety of reasons, we haven't been willing to go to the mat yet.
I think there are a couple of problems here. One of them, which is actually the area that Herb knows well, is one is the forensics. You will be able to figure out who did something bad to you, but it may take 8 months.
Right.
Meanwhile, you have no electricity. But when you finally figure out, oh, it was them, and then you can respond. But you're not going to respond unless you know it's them. And this is the big problem: is it a false flag operation? Did they really do it? Is it something else? And so in the digital sphere, it takes a very long time. Whereas, in the kinetic realm of war, traditional warfare has always been. I mean, you either see the rock coming or you see the missile coming, on your radar.
And you know where it came from.
And you know who did it. Now, of course, the U.S. actually, in the U.S. case, I don't know about other countries because they're not quite like this, but the U.S. did say already 5 years ago that the U.S. will not necessarily respond to a cyber attack in the same domain, meaning if they know you did it, we'll come get you maybe with a rock or with a bomber. But as I said, the problem with that is that it's the delay until you figure out who did it. First you figure out what happened. If you blow up if a rocket hits a power plant, you basically know what happened and who did it. But if a power plant sort of fizzles, has happened twice in Ukraine, you go, well, first you think, was there a screw up? And then you go and start figuring out what happened. In fact, in our case in Estonia in 2007, it took us, it didn't take us that long, but you have to eliminate all these things. Is there a problem in our net? Did we do something wrong? Had something screwed up? And then when you finally figured out that it's not us, it's not our system, and that we are being attacked, well, then it was already like day 3.
Anyway, no.
I'm Anders Slavinskis from Tartu Observatory and Ames Research Center. So I'll go through 4 levels of security that we see now. So first of all, when you register to this, email will come in plain text in your password will come in plain text in your email. So don't use anything fancy. Then, so Bank of America, just an email, just a password, quite simple one, coming from Estonia and Latvia. So it's surprising for me how Bank of America does it. I have an ID card, but I have to admit it's it's not easy to use it. I have spent hours and hours.
We've been given a sign from the back that the time is short here, so if you could speed up your question.
Okay, so still, then now we have Smart ID, excellent, and but it still takes time. Arguably, we're facing now a cyborg era, and how can we make authentication seamless so that my hard device, when getting an update, wouldn't actually ask for me to enter anything or to do anything?
To do better authentication quickly, there are lots of people working on that, and it's an active topic of research. We can talk about that offline if you like, but it's an important question that you raised. Yeah.
Ducky Munyan, I'm the executive director of a blockchain consortium. One of the things that I've observed sort of being a practitioner in the security domain is what seems to be happening is espionage and the tools and techniques of espionage are starting to pervade society. Like it's no longer just spy versus spy. Have you thought a lot about what the consequences of that are for democracy, for living in the modern world? What is it like to be where everybody has to start thinking about OPSEC and learning sort of the language of spies?
Well, one of the battles with NATO is to get NATO to get out of the espionage paradigm of thinking about these things. Typical is like, Estonian would go to NATO and say, look, we've discovered this new threat. And then when the response is, oh, you discovered it too, you kind of turn around and go, wait a minute, why didn't we know about this? Because we're still thinking precisely in espionage terms when we do cybersecurity, and there are 5 eyes or the 5 countries that talk to one another on electronic communications or security, cybersecurity, and the rest of the countries, and there 2 of them, 3 of them, 2 of them are not even in NATO, New Zealand and Australia, and they talk with the United States, Canada, and the UK, and meanwhile NATO, which is supposed to be protecting all this, does not share that information like that. So it's hard. The sort of espionage paradigm is hard to get out of, and as you rightly say, it's getting more and more like that because there's so much value in information that it's a commercial thing now. Steal someone's password, get their bank account, get money.
Hi, Hi, my name is Rosanna Guadagno. I am a social scientist, and I've been studying the internet for almost since it began. And just one cool thing I'm going to add, and then I have an open-ended question for you. I actually published a paper on the Estonia cyber attack called The First Internet War with one of the white hats who came and helped you. Together we worked on it, and so it was really cool seeing you here. And I don't know if you remember me, but
I do.
Okay. So here's my question. The thing I've been really worried about lately is the integrity of our democracy, the integrity of elections, and as far as I can see, lack of response from the administration to do anything about it, because it's kind of in their vested interest not to. So what does that mean for 2018? How will we know that the election results are accurate? What can we do?
Well, one thing that is done, I assume will happen, is that there was actually, since election commissions are state-based, there was a lot of kind of state rights approach to this, that in fact when they were, from what I read, I don't know, but that when in fact the FBI or whoever was responsible was warning certain states that they're vulnerable or they apparently had been attacked, they were just sort of told to bug off by the states, because this was an infringement upon the state's prerogative to handle these things. Now, since we've seen at least that some voting machines, electronic voting machines, had been compromised, or had been found to be compromisable. So I would hope that by 2018, some kind of action is taken in this direction, but I don't know.
I'm personally afraid that anything that we've gone politically, I'm afraid that, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that we've gone to the point where if a compromise of a hack election helps my party, then it's an okay thing to do, and if it helps them, it's not. And that's what I fear the future is.
Well, I know I've been hacked. Back in 1995, when I first saw computers in the library, there were two boys about 12 years old copying stuff off the internet and putting it on their own website. Behind them stood the little old gray-haired lady grandmother, and all of a sudden she jumped up and said to her grandchildren, "Never put your real name on the internet." Grandmothers knew this back in 1995. With respect to Equifax, somebody smashed my window and came in and stole all my personal papers, so I know they got all my data. So I had to call up, cancel all my accounts or freeze them or whatever. And when I came to Social Security, she had to identify me. And she paused and said, "Well, just a minute, I will have to check with Equifax." In order to identify me, Social Security had to check with Equifax. That's what she said. So that was the power that Equifax has, apparently because so many people believe that the government is inefficient and people like Equifax, being private, are efficient. So my question is, with this two-step process you're talking about, since I happen to have heard and believe that T-Mobile is owned by a German company and Sprint is owned by a Japanese company, and when I go on the web, I keep finding that these companies are all tied together, and as you know, a lot of them talk to each other out in Woodside. How do I know that when I go in a two-step process, that the people from one step, because what you do is you go to one account, and then they're going to send an email to your other account, which gives you a code that you go back to your first account. Well, if those two guys are tied together, the two-step process is not efficient either. Do we know the two-step process is really efficient and these guys they're not intertwined with each other? Because Stanford over here will not allow their researchers to use any other cloud except their own. They say Google Cloud is not secure.
Well, you're saying that if you need two really independent factors, and what if they're not really independent? I agree, that's a risk. But it's certainly better than assuming than doing one. So Toomas's advice is still right. It doesn't give you ironclad security, and there will come a time when we need three-factor authentication. There is no perfect security. The point is that what Toomas is saying is you can do better than you have now, which is manifestly true. Yeah.
I'm Eilif Tronsen. I have spent over 30 years at the SRI campus over here. I remember in 1986, SRI launched a program called I4, International Information Integrity Institute, I think it was. And we sent a lot of people to Washington to look at these issues. And I don't know if DARPA was behind this, but from what I know about DARPA, it's a very forward-looking agency, considering all kinds of things. But from what I heard from you, it seems like we have not adequately considered the bad things that the internet could be used for. And that surprises me that DARPA did not develop scenarios for what we are now encountering. Did they totally ignore it, or did they do research but we didn't implement things, or?
DARPA funded the report that I described to you in 1991 from the National Academy of Sciences. DARPA funded that. So, I mean, DARPA is aware of the computer security issues, and it has been for a long time, and in fact supports a lot of research, both classified and unclassified.
But awareness only goes so far.
No, I understand. No, they do real research in the field, and they fund people, and I mean they fund. I know they fund Peter Neumann at SRI very generously, and he does good work. And so there are efforts to do this. I don't understand your question.
So Toomas said that NATO seemed to not really pay attention until very recently about this. Was the same true with the U.S. Defense Department? And
the U.S. Defense Department has been working on this stuff for a while, but as we said, it's a bureaucracy. It takes a lot of time.
So should we be optimistic that will change now, or?
It's a political decision.
It's a political decision,
and
right.
if the political decision is to be concerned, then there will be movement. If the political decision is this might be embarrassing, they won't do anything. But I would say, I mean, the internet was invented originally to deal with an altogether different problem, which was what happens if there's a nuclear attack, and how do you communicate with each other afterwards, and to have this distributed network where everything can connect to everything. And that's what the whole sort of packet exchange and all that stuff works. That's designed for that. And I think when they designed it so they would, in case the U.S. was attacked by a nuclear bomb, then you could still communicate. They didn't think about, sort of the possibilities of internet porn, probably. That just wasn't part of the... Right.
Obviously a very exciting topic, but unfortunately we are completely out of time. So thank you all so much for coming, and please join me in thanking our speakers.